Grace and peace, St. Luke, beloved, and friends. This coming Sunday is the anniversary of our magnificent building, our church building, our school. And I want us to try in this brief video to see this building through the eyes of others, through the eyes of children, and through the eyes of the immigrant. Seeing St. Luke through the eyes of children is my joy and delight every Wednesday when we have chapel. One of the children in the primary grades is responsible for holding a small cross to lead us in. The children all line up in the atrium and with their hands folded. And as we walk in together, often with our cantor playing something which will help us get the mood of holiness and worship. The children walk in, and I watch their eyes every week just get wider and wider as they walk past the baptismal font with the water bubbling and making sounds, walking down the center aisle towards the high altar with the cross behind it and the magnificent space around it. Today in chapel, I read a passage, which we'll read on Sunday, where Solomon stands in front of the temple and altar, and I stood in front of the altar like Solomon with my hands raised and prayed a prayer of thanks that God's name would be put here in this place, that the God who is everywhere and can't be contained would be willing to be found here. And then I asked the children, where's God? And of course, the first answers were, up there, in heaven or whatever. And of course, we got around to talking about how important it is that God's name is in our churches, our sanctuaries. Because if God is somewhere, we can believe that God is everywhere, that God is with us, and we remember it when we are in that beautiful sanctuary. And children certainly remember a sense of the holy. Their ability to adapt and to worship is amazing. But then as we continued to talk, we talked about how God is also not up there, not only in here in this church, but also in here, in my heart. And we sang, I've got the love of Jesus down in my heart. And we talked about how God is with each of us personally. And then we talked about, as we leave the church, that we follow God into the world who's already there, with our loved ones, our families, with people in need, with people who are happy. And so the church is kind of that way of anchoring our idea that God is not just beyond, but here with us. And I hope when we celebrate this anniversary, whether it's virtually or whether we are together, that we see this church through a child's eyes. Second, I want us to think about seeing our church through the immigrant's eyes, especially since immigration is so troubling for all of us today. And because we are encouraged too often to not think of the immigrant as human, but as a problem or as something to be feared. And of course, immigrants built our beautiful church, mostly from Germany. And it's through the eyes of immigrants that I want us to look at what St. Luke has meant over the centuries. And to do that, I simply wanted you to think about your own immigration story if you know it. And if not, to imagine, as again I tell mine, that my grandfather, Herbert Jansen Bouman, came from the small town of Norden in Ostfriesland on the North Sea for the same reasons that most people come here. Number one, they were poor. They were farmers. The land did not yield easily, and so they wanted to provide better for their children. Second was for freedom. Um, they were living in the growing imperialism of Bismarck and the Kaiser, and were cannon fodder for wars that they weren't really believing in. And also for freedom of religion. They wanted to be Lutheran, and the religion was basically Protestant in those days, and everyone kind of wanted to amalgamate into one kind of homogenized Protestant church. They were Lutheran. So they came for their family. They came for opportunity. They came for freedom. They came because of their faith. And I want you to imagine that arduous journey. They left from Bremerhaven then spent days and days and days. And one of my grandfather's brothers chronicled the journey, told about what happened, and how by the time they got to New York, he was sick to his stomach every day. And they just were briefly in New York, and they got on a train. And at midnight on Saturday night in Clara City, Minnesota, the pastor was there to greet them at the train station. And the next day, the pastor took them to church. And I want you to see our church through the eyes of immigrants. They met their first people to help them in church. After church, the fellow members took them to their first farm, gave them the seed corn for the first harvest, raised the barn. The church was at the center of welcoming my family into life here in the United States. And it was a rock of faith that really propelled my immigrant family. So think about Chicago. Think of all those spires that you see when you go on the Kennedy or the Dan Ryan or the Eisenhower. These spires erupting into the sky. Think of how hungry our immigrant forebears were for worshiping in their heart language, for beauty, for stability in the midst of a hard working class, often working poor life. So, through the eyes of children and through the eyes of immigrants, may we see our church on its anniversary as a place that still is a part of welcoming immigrants, welcoming children, and always welcoming you and me, and reminding us that God is with us in church, in our hearts, and wherever we are in the world. Happy birthday, St. Luke's.